Let me perhaps give an example. If some barbarian, say from the mafia, comes to a pianist and breaks his fingers, what would be the response? Threatening the hoodlum by breaking his fingers that he uses anyhow only to poke his nose? Israel cannot listen to the United Nations. This is a hostile organization where you have a combination of authoritarians, totalitarians, and barbarians discussing the nature of democracy, and they are the majority. And very often the Europeans are their collaborators because they want to have a better position in the United Nations, so they need the support of barbaric states. We've seen recently a very disturbing phenomenon where the criticism of Israel, I'd rather say the condemnation of Israel in very, very wide circles in Western civilization, not just by known anti-Semites and haters of Israel and critics of Israel and people, the usual suspects, but very widely and broadly in public opinion, the leadership, condemning Israel for what Israel is doing in this war. And I think I can explain a large part of it by putting it in a broader cultural context. Israel must, and recently more than ever before, challenge the zeitgeist of our time that is prevalent in Western civilization. The term zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, reflects the kind of culture, norms, perceptions of good and bad, expectations that you have in a different period. It changes from time to time. It was in the end of the 19th century very different than what it became after the First World War. It is something that reflects what people perceive to be the right thing or the wrong thing, the spirit of the age. And what we have since the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the collapse of Nazism, was a perception in the West that we, the liberal democracies, basically won. You don't have to go to the end of history, but it is enough to say that there was this perception that we in the West, with our values, with our liberalism, with our democratic system of government, basically proved to the whole world that we can provide a better life and better quality of life, and that because of the media, everybody realizes that we are the success and everybody wants the success, and people want to come and live in our countries because they realized how good life is in our countries. And yes, there are other places in the world where this is not finally established, but we are at least in the direction where others recognize it too, and it's a kind of global recognition. And what we also have, or at least we should develop, is some kind of global, universal solidarity. We should care for people all over the world. So the perception is that since everybody knows that good life is a life of peace and democracy, and since everybody wants to come and live in democratic, peaceful states in Europe, in the United States, in Australia, where have you, and since the media made it common knowledge, since everybody knows how we live and wants to live this way, then we can speak about global solidarity, universal solidarity. We can offer asylum in our own countries for people who are persecuted anywhere in the world, so they can come. And these ideas are very noble, and I can understand them, and I would have wanted to share some of them. only people were not thinking it through. For instance, if you say we have global solidarity and everybody in the world that is suffering has a right to come to the United States or to a European country, what happens when billions of people come? I mean, billions are unhappy. Hundreds of millions are persecuted. What happens if they come to Europe and bring their own culture, which is very, very different from the open-minded, pluralistic culture that we have dominant in the United States or in Europe, but also this idea that there is a kind of universal will of the people. There is the international community, and we have a rule-based society, and we have international law, and this is determined by international organizations. And whereas not everybody is there yet, everybody should be on the way to this direction, because isn't it what people want, a better life? And have we not proved that having a better life can only be done under these circumstances? So it's a process. We are not yet there, but this is a direction. And then, of course, what you shouldn't do is to use force. And if you have to use force on a very limited scale, in the very uncommon situations where other means don't work, then at least use it proportionally. And when you define proportionality, when you explain what proportionality means you do to your enemies what your enemies have done to you, and not much more than that, because otherwise you are being disproportionate, and so on. And this kind of view of the world, this kind of Weltanschauung, was deeply embedded in what has developed in recent decades in the world. And Israel must, if it wants to survive, go against it in a very major way. First of all, because if Israel will not use force, it will not exist. I will explain it in a moment. Second, if you take this definition of proportionality, this concept of proportionality, the inevitable result is failure. If you will be proportionate in this technical way, you will lose, because the barbarians will make it impossible for you to live. And even if you don't lie, and most people who criticize Israel do lie, they're not even aware, not always aware that they're lying, but they don't want to find out an uncomfortable truth, because it's very comfortable for them to say something that is completely wrong and untrue. If Israel will abide by these rules, Israel will not exist. Let me explain it on a number of different levels, and it came to the fore in Gaza, because Gaza was a very extreme case where it was impossible to accept these norms. If Israel would have accepted these norms, Israel in the long run would not be able to exist, because if we would have failed in Gaza, every barbarian in the region would come to kill us, knowing that he is protected by this zeitgeist. Israel is surrounded by a very hostile environment, where even when the governments understand that they cannot afford to have a war with Israel, as we have in Egypt, as we have in Jordan, or even when the people in power, like President Assad, both Presidents Assad in their time, were very radical but responsible. In other words, they knew that if they make war against Israel, the consequences for Syria would be unacceptable to Syria. Syria would be ruined. We have around us, first of all, Palestinians who never take responsibility for their deeds, who don't mind if they destroy their own society for generations and make it impossible for them to have a better life because they're committed to the destruction of the State of Israel, or people, jihadists, or people like those who run Hezbollah and Hamas, who again don't care about their own people, are completely committed, intoxicated by the need to kill Jews. This is what Hamas is all about. By the way, they say it. They say it openly. They say, you Jews will lose because you love life, and we, people in Gaza, will win because we love death. We're speaking about the death cult. We're speaking about something that is so profoundly uncivilized that people in Europe or in the United States find it difficult to understand how depraved this culture is. And these people get up in the morning to kill Jews. This is what they are about. And if you don't come at night and you arrest them or you kill them, they will get up in the morning and they will kill you. And if you don't, when you have good information about a terrorist group that is organized in Nablus, if you don't come at 3 o'clock in the morning and arrest their members, these people the next morning will come to my university or pizzeria or bus and do what they have done in the past. They call it intifada. By the way, they openly say, and their supporters in the United States and in Europe openly say, they want to globalize the intifada, namely to do it not only in the Middle East, not only directly against Israel, but against Jews and against people in America and in Europe. They want to have a globalized intifada. So if you don't prevent them from doing it before they do it, they will do it to you. And when you ask those who don't do it why they don't do it, they will explain that they are afraid of the retribution. And the only reason that keeps them from doing it is the fear of what Israel would do. Let me give you an interesting example. We have a peace treaty with Egypt and Jordan. And the peace treaty works very well because President Sisi and King Abdullah know that a war will mean calamity for Egypt and for Jordan. But in both cases, and particularly in Jordan, they have a very, 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 very radical public opinion. In Jordan, because it is comprised by Palestinians and Muslim brothers, of people who are urging the government to do it, and very often on an individual basis will do it because this is what they are about. And they will definitely support barbarians who will do it. For instance, it's interesting that after the 7th of October, there was a very high proportion of people in Gaza supporting what happened the 7th of October, but the proportion of people in the West Bank supporting it was even higher than in Gaza. And even today in public opinion polls, you will find 60%, 70% among Palestinians who are supporting the idea of, or are willing to justify what happened on the 7th of October, and very often say, we want to do it again. So you have to use force preventively. This is what Israel learned from October 7th. If you try to appease, if you try to contain, you will have a major war. If you want to prevent a major war, use force every day, because if you don't, it will erupt into war. And this is the most important change in Israeli public opinion. Today, the overwhelming majority of Israelis support preventive actions in order to prevent a major war. When you contain, you don't promote peace, you promote war. When you contain barbarians, you promote war. Now to proportionality. Of course, people don't expect that Israel will do to the Arabs what Arabs do to the Jews. What would Israel do in Gaza? Rape Gazan women, burn Gazan babies, do the same thing to them that they did to us with the support of their population, and they're proud of doing it, and they filmed it so that they will be able to show, to be proud of what they have done. These were not only the sentiments of the barbarians who invaded Israel, these were the instructions given to them by their leaders. So, of course, we can't and we shouldn't and we won't do to them what they do to us. But if we respond to them in the level of violence that they expose to us, that ruins our life, because we have a civilized life of people who are trying to build their own society. The level of violence among the radical enemies of Israel in the Arab world is anyhow much higher every day than the kind of violence Israel would use if it were proportional in the simplistic and formal sense of the term. The purpose of the Israeli response is to deter them from war. And if they can get away by their own terms with what Israel did, then war will be much more prevalent than before. So, from an Israeli point of view, we need to have the kind of response that will make it unacceptable for the other side to make war. Since Israelis value life dramatically more than their radical Arab enemies, and they say so, and they always require that if they give up one hostage, Israel gives up 100, because they know that their lives are much more important to Israel than the lives of their people are important to them. And again, they say so. Okay? So, if you don't kill as many terrorists as you possibly can, if you don't demolish the houses that are booby-trapped to kill Israeli soldiers, if you don't demolish them, then the radical Arab enemies of Israel will have the satisfaction of many Israeli soldiers killed, and the assumption that if many Israeli soldiers are killed, then Israel cannot afford to respond to their aggression. So, let me perhaps give an example. If some barbarian, say from the mafia, comes to a pianist and breaks his fingers, what would be the response? Threatening the hoodlum by breaking his fingers that he uses anyhow only to poke his nose? You need to make it so impossible for him to do it because he cannot take the consequences like we cannot take the consequences of what they do. The proportion, it needs to be proportional, but proportional to the damage it does to the other side. So, Israel must respond in a way that will prevent wars. In other words, it must be preventive in the use of force. And since practically all international organizations are either hostile to Israel or radicalized to the point where they become objectively hostile to Israel, Israel cannot listen to them. Israel cannot listen to the United Nations. This is a hostile organization where you have a combination of authoritarians, totalitarians, and barbarians discussing the nature of democracy, and they are the majority. And very often, the Europeans are their collaborators because they want to have a better position in the United Nations, so they need the support of barbaric states and of autocracies and of totalitarian regimes, because they are the majority, the overwhelming majority of the United Nations. So the United Nations has already taken decisions in the General Assembly where the United Nations, where the United States doesn't have a veto, that actually means the extinction of the State of Israel. So the United Nations is a hostile body. And the only thing that defends Israel from the United Nations as an enemy of Israel is the American veto. If you take other international organizations, they're all prostituted. The International Health Organization, the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, practically every international organization, because it is determined by states, and the majority of states are hostile to Israel. And even if you come to organizations such Amnesty or Human Rights Watch, they started out in the 1980s as trying to tell liberal regimes, when you legitimately defend yourself, here is what you shouldn't do. But they ended up being dominated with a hostile takeover of radicals, where today they basically present symmetrically Western organizations or Western countries that are not perfect with perfect barbarians, and they present it in a symmetric way. Both sides will be, and this is also true about the courts in The Hague. Again, they symmetrically want to arrest the Prime Minister of Israel and the head of Hamas. So Israel cannot, if Israel were to listen to them, Israel would not exist. Okay? I once presented my difficulties with Europe to a number of European ambassadors, and I told them, Israel has a problem with Europe, but not a dilemma. A problem because if the Europeans will apply sanctions on Israel, it will hurt Israel on a major scale, but not a dilemma because listening to the Europeans is not an option. If, God forbid, Israel would listen to Europe, Saddam Hussein would have nuclear weapons, Assad would have nuclear weapons, and Palestinian terrorism will make life in Tel Aviv impossible. Because when Israel did what it needed in order to prevent it, Israel was ostracized, was condemned by the Europeans, by the way, sometimes even by the Americans. When Israel prevented Saddam Hussein from having nuclear weapons, the United States even applied sanctions on Israel. And a very large majority of American public opinion was against what Israel did because of some, I don't know, Israel violating the sovereignty of Iraq or the sovereignty of Syria. You must be ridiculous if you even bring this issue up. When barbarians are building nuclear weapons, you ask yourself, have you violated their sovereignty or not? It's a ridiculous approach. So Israel must confront the existing zeitgeist. People who believe, by the way, the same people believed that there will not be a war in Central Europe. And they were surprised by the war in the Ukraine because they didn't realize Putin is a barbarian. Yes, it doesn't make sense for Putin to make war. It doesn't make Western sense to make war in the Ukraine, but he did it in 2014 and he got away with it. So why not do it again? And the whole idea that this will be prevented by the United Nations. The United Nations never had any kind of impact in terms of bringing peace in any region. It is completely helpless and indeed counterproductive in everything that is important in terms of world peace. So what outrages people in Western societies, including journalists who live in this la-la land more than others, including academics who live in this la-la land more than others. Now, of course, this is not true of all journalists, of all academics, but they tend to be given to it more. So when you have a hostile organization to Israel like the BBC, let me put it this way. If the BBC is not outraged by something that Israel did the wrong thing. Okay? And by the way, unfortunately, this is true about something that is much less radical in its hostility to Israel, like the New York Times. Basically, what you get is allegations that Jews kill children. When you have major European and Canadian and Australian leaders say Israel killed 65,000 people in Gaza, not only do they trust Hamas with their numbers, but they even disregard the fact that about half of them are terrorists, and it's good to kill them. The only thing you can do with terrorists is to kill them. Even Obama killed Osama bin Laden.